Welcome back to Crafting a Meaningful Life. I'm Mary Crafts, and I get to be with you again today. As always, as we craft this life, as always, as we step forward, really making our own decisions as to what our life is going to look like, I get to look around and say, who is it that will bring something of value to all of my listeners that will be a piece for them of that crafting? And so today, as my very special guest, I have with me Brandon Condie. Brandon, welcome.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me on your podcast.
I am just so thrilled to have you. Well, shortly you'll get to see why I really fell in love with Brandon. I only met you once.
Yeah.
And that was at the Silicon Slopes Promise to Live Town Hall,
Yeah.
which happens once a month
Yeah.
for mental health awareness and suicide prevention. And there's always a great panel.
Yeah. It was a great panel.
I've got a lot of people to be on this podcast from those panels, but there was something about you. And while you were talking, John leaned over to me, my husband, and said, "You're having him on your podcast, aren't you?" I said, "I'm going to ask."
I appreciate that. That's really kind of you.
Well, you were so engaging. You were like a real person. You were talking on levels that people can understand. And you were talking about things that everyone at some point has experienced at least a piece of.
Yeah.
So let's start there, Brandon. Let's start with a little bit about your background and what brought you to the point of working at where you are now.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. So I'll try to keep this in a nutshell. It was interesting because during the course of my education, I always wanted to be doing something that was helping people improve. I didn't want to just jump into something that was going to be a paycheck. So it took me a minute, but eventually I remember it dawned on me when I was actually dating this girl who was actually in law school at the University of Utah. And we were chatting about human behavior, and I'd already finished up my bachelor's degree. And I thought, God, I've never even thought about psychology and getting into that. So I did a little bit of research and started looking into classes and so forth, and it just snowballed from there. So that then led me to going to graduate school up in Oregon. In Portland, finishing up working for Kaiser and then starting my own private practice.
Wow. And so what was the actual degree in? What did you do?
Clinical psychology.
Okay. The big one. Okay.
Big one. Yes. Yes. So I've had a private practice for about 19 years, just down off of Center Street in Provo. And been doing that, and then also developing, and we never had a chance to talk about this, but we can if you want to.
Yeah.
But developing a software and an application that's on the mobile phones to help people connect with people they actually trust in times of crisis and in times of need, especially with their mental health, and especially with this being Suicide Prevention Month.
Yeah.
It's one of those kind of things that there's a lot of crisis resources out there, but that's what they are. They're crisis resources, and what we've developed is along the lines of being more proactive. So that's the secondary side of me.
So I love that you actually have an app now. Everyone knows about 411. Well, most people know about 411 if you're in some sort of a crisis, but it's not like I need the police to come ASAP. That's a 911. That there's a support system out there. So what do you specifically offer that's different than the 411?
Yeah, so the way that we've developed this is that you actually select from your own contacts, people that you trust, to be alerted when things aren't going well. So there's metrics within the application. So you're rating on a daily basis your mood, your anxiety, your energy levels, your self-worth, things of that nature. And based off those things, you get to customize how you want those support systems to be alerted. So it's a little more proactive. You can say like, well, I know when I'm going 3 days and my mood has not improved above like say a 3. I know that I'm not doing well, and I need that support. But the one thing, and we talked a little bit about this at town hall, which is that the prefrontal cortex, the limbic system, and what's happening is that people get shoved into that limbic system, and that's the emotional brain.
Yeah.
And when they're there, they don't think well. None of us do. And so when we're in a crisis, what we need that support, and we actually want to get it, but we don't really know how to reach out. And so this is kind of compensating for that gap, if that makes any sense. A little more complicated, hard to do just over the microphone, but it's meant to kind of like be something that people are able to do so they're not getting into that crisis phase. And so they don't have to be calling 911, 988, and all the different type of hotlines.
So it's much more of a proactive kind of an approach rather than a reactionary approach to what's going on.
Yeah.
How do people become aware and become part of that network?
Of that application.
Of your app.
Yeah, so it's actually in both the stores. It's in the Google Play Store as well as the Apple's App Store. Underneath One U, it's all one word, just ONEYOU. So what they do is they'll download the app. It's free. And so you can download it and then you just set it all up. So you're actually going into your own contacts, as we'll pull from your phone's contacts. You go in, pick somebody, and then you set it up however you want to.
Wow.
Yeah, it's really quick and easy.
And the reason the world doesn't know about this is...
We're just getting started.
Because I'm just thinking, even my teenage grandchildren, I'm like, they should be registered. They should have this app.
Yeah.
Because I listen to all that's going on out there, and even though I think my grandchildren are happy, well-adapted children, everyone has those moments.
They do. And that's the funny thing is I think a lot of times I love where we're at right now with how often we're talking and how common it is to discuss mental health. Because the town hall over at Silicon Slopes, that was one of the things I really loved about they were doing is they were talking about this blend between physical and mental health and how those two kind of affect one another. We talk a lot about physical health, whether we're going to a doctor, whether we're exercising, engaging in those kind of activities, we know are healthy for us. And we talked about sleep, exercise, those type of activities. We're now getting better at talking about the other side of it, which is your mental health. And so that's where I think that the shift is now going, and I like that. It's good because once you get the balance between those two, you're in good shape because you start to feel more in control of your world and yourself. And when that happens, mental health doesn't really become much of an issue. You'll fluctuate. You'll have your ups and downs, which is what you're supposed to do. We're supposed to feel anxious. We're supposed to feel depressed, but you're not getting stuck there once you have that control and balance.
I think that was part of the conversation that day that I really loved was this looking at the whole.
Yeah.
So long with Western medicine, we've been looking at a piece, and then over here there's a piece, and over here there's a piece, but when you can look at the whole, and no, life is not about, how long you spend at the gym. But your physical health and fitness is a reflection oftentimes of your mental health stability. Yeah. And then sometimes well, I'm just emotionally happy all the time, so I don't really need to worry about my physical part. Well, that's not true either. So in working hand in hand, these are pieces that you don't know about me, but at age 50, I weighed 284 pounds. And 49% body fat, and worked like a dog in my business, had never set foot in the gym in my life. And so, but people would laugh and joke with me about, I know you struggle with your weight and things, Mary, but you're so happy and you're an accomplished entrepreneur. You're fine. You're doing great. But that physical piece was reflecting the unsettledness, the unhappiness that was inside. And the one thing about weight is you wear it on your sleeve. You can't hide it. So many times people have those emotional distresses that are easily hidden, or they think that they're easily hidden, as long as they maintain their physical part. So I, more than anyone, know the value. And people say, "Wow, Mary, that must have taken so much work to lose half of your body weight and way more than half of your body fat. What the heck?" I'm like, it wasn't the easiest thing, but it wasn't the hardest, because as I began to heal my inside first, my desire to be physically fit and my coping mechanisms of eating began to just fall away. And so you always wonder what comes first, the chicken or the egg. Well, I think I asked that to you that day at Silicon Slopes. What do you think is first? Focus on physical and focus on emotional. And you said, well, actually, it all works hand in hand.
Yes, it didn't matter. It doesn't matter. Yeah. You start where it's easiest.
Yeah, that's absolutely right.
Just get started.
So as you talk to people like that day at Silicon Slopes, one of the things that you began with was the shift from this lymphatic system to, you called it the thinking part of your brain. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, the prefrontal cortex.
Yeah, right up here, which really isn't developed fully until you've developed all your natural habitats.
Right.
But, and some people, for example, I know a woman who is now in her 40s. She still does not have a complete frontal cortex. She still thinks and acts in that fight or flight response all the time. So when people find themselves in that position of wanting to do, and they're caught up all the time in fight or flight, what do you see as some of the first steps to begin to move themselves physically and mentally to that frontal cortex?
Yeah. So to give you a bit of a background, I think our society has really emphasized the emotional side of ourselves. So you see that in movies, you see that in commercials, you see all of this emphasis on emotion. So then we start to put an emphasis on thinking that's what we should be. We should be emotional creatures. And that's fine, but emotions play a very specific role in our life. And they're very important, but they're very specific. And when they start to bleed into other areas of our lives, it is catastrophic. Because any emotional conclusions and decisions that we make are almost always going to be wrong. The prefrontal cortex does that job. And so the emphasis kind of almost keeps us from using it the way we're supposed to and keeping that balance between those two. The prefrontal cortex doesn't really honestly fully develop until about age 25, so mid-20s. Yeah. The limbic system, which is our emotional brain, it's one of the first to develop. Yeah. As a result of that, it tends to be that knee-jerk response. It's that thing that always responds first just to kind of assess the circumstances for possible threat and so forth. And see, it's also the pleasure centers of the brain. So I always just kind of joke with my patients or my clients, I say, it's stay alive and perpetuate the species. It's just a natural instinct. So that's there. And then the prefrontal needs time because it's got to gather life experiences. So when it comes to people learning how to be better at shifting that, the breathing thing is one thing we did at the Silicon Slopes. I don't know if you know this, but the next week I went on to the Good Things Utah. And we did a spot there, kind of demonstrated it.
I think I did see that because I follow Nisha and Shuri a lot. And so, yeah.
So that's one way, because that nerve that's connected to the diaphragm, that can activate, or I should say deactivate, the limbic system response. But there's a lot of other things that people can be doing. I think I mentioned them in the town hall, which is that people can do math. It's funny to think that saying 2 + 2 and solving that equation is going to actually help you be more logical, but it does. Because what it does is it requires that limbic system, or the prefrontal cortex. It requires that logical brain. You can spell. Laughter actually helps. If you can laugh, a good belly laugh, it vibrates the diaphragm, which activates that nerve and helps people to relax and get out of that limbic response. If you look at it, it's kind of funny because everybody knows somebody who does that nervous laugh, and they don't know why they're doing it, but that is why they're doing it. The tension is building up, and they've got to have a release valve, and sometimes they'll do that nervous laughter to kind of help calm themselves down a little bit.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I love that idea when you see people laugh that it might. And there's a big difference between that kind of laugh and the belly laugh where you just are just.
I think that's why comedies are so popular, is because it gives people the opportunity to, escape, but also to relax.
Yeah.
Because of just the physiological and the biological, response to stress.
So I've been doing prana breathing for a long time, but maybe walk with my listeners through that and just kind of what that looks like.
Yeah.
And I will tell my listeners right now that if you're a woman, you do not want to do this naturally, but you have to get mentally past that because the idea is to stick out your belly. Okay. So, and all women are like, no, I'm not going to do that. But the difference when you actually do that kind of breath work is phenomenal. So let's walk through that.
Yeah. So kind of as we talked about limbic system, prefrontal cortex. That's what you're trying to do, is shift those two. And just from on an educational standpoint, if you look at it, and you can probably even look this up, Google it or whatever, but there's a nerve that's connected to the diaphragm, which kind of sits just a little bit below the rib cage. That nerve, if it's ever tugged on, basically through the breathing, it activates what's called the vasovagal nerve. That sends signals to the brain to calm down. There's no threat. So there's a book I have called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. It's by Robert Sapolsky. It's actually a really good book. He's a Stanford neurobiologist. It is a
great book.
Oh, you read it?
Yeah.
Yay! You're about the only person I know. It's actually
it's that deal of why they can go back to eating grass as soon as they've been chased by a lion.
Exactly. Yeah, because they'll shift. One of the things he gets into in that book is the fact that humans create their own stress. It basically by either dreaming up fears and things of that nature. From life experiences or just because you just develop them. So that's all we're doing is we're just trying to shift it. And that nerve, it's a biological response. And I can't say that things are 100% on most things, but this is 100% because it's biology. Yeah. So in terms of walking through it, and I know that some of the viewers or listeners can actually watch this as well, right?
Yes.
So the biggest thing I always tell people to do is use your hands as biofeedback. So you put a hand on your stomach and on your chest. And I always demonstrate this by saying, if you watch my chest, I'll do a chest breath first. And So the chest will rise and fall, shoulders tend to rise and fall. But if
And
I
when
belly
you,
breathe,
when you ask people to take a deep breath, you watch them, and that's just what they do.
yeah. Well, this is where we naturally breathe during the day because we're active, we're busy, kind of like the zebra. It's like it's active, and so
Right.
we tend to be more in that chest breath during our day. So when we sleep, we are actually in our belly. It's relaxed. So when the belly breathe, it is what nobody wants to do, which is push your stomach out. But when I do it, it's pretty obvious, and hopefully they'll be able to see this on camera. But so can you see the difference?
Oh, yeah.
So the thing is that when someone's walking themselves through this, the biggest thing is really just about keeping the chest still, the shoulders still, and making sure the belly is being pushed out. And it doesn't have to be so emphasized that it hurts. It's just making sure it's deliberate.
Yeah.
And the thing is that you'll feel the effects pretty quickly if you're hitting it right, because that nerve is being tugged on. It's activating that nerve in order to relax the limbic system.
I start every day with this.
It's really, really good. That's funny. I have two things that people always talk to me about and say, like, oh my gosh, why didn't someone tell me about this, that are really, really effective? The deep breathing and what's called the thought record. It's to help them be more balanced and logical in their thinking. That are like, this is so good. This has been so effective. And it's funny because it's breathing. It's like one of the simplest things, but we're not using it properly to our advantage, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. And for me, if I think about, I need to stick out my belly, then I find I don't do it as well.
Yeah.
But if I think that I need to expand my entire core here and my whole core is filling, then I'm not conscious about my belly. But if I think about that, but if I just think about my belly, I'm like, oh no, don't stick out that belly. So I really had to work at reprogramming how I think of it mentally.
Yeah. And it's important because I have to go through this with my clients all the time, and that is that it's not complicated. I think sometimes when people talk about belly breathing or deep breathing, diaphragmatic breathing, there's this concept or conceptualization that you need to breathe in through your nose and out through your mouth and hold your breath for so many seconds, and you've got to visualize certain things. And although those things can be beneficial to do those things, the bottom line is if you're just trying to biologically shift, it's just the nerve.
It is just that nerve.
And so you can do all the other stuff later once you've got the breathing down. But because I'm always like, what if you have a cold? I mean, you're not going to be able to breathe into your nose and out through your mouth, which means it's not available to you. But the reality is it's just about the nerve. So you can do that however you want.
Right.
Then people can start doing the visualization and they can start counting if they'd like to. And
I love the counting. At first when I started, I could do about 10 seconds of breath in and 10 seconds of breath out. And now I can do 20 seconds of breath in, just brought it up one by 1 second by 1 second. And you can certainly, I've heard of people who can do 36 seconds in and 30 seconds, but I don't have a goal for that. But it's amazing what it shifts inside. I do it before every meditation, and to really get me out of those fears.
Well, the thing is like David Goggins. Are you familiar with him? So I like his book. The first book he put out, which was Can't Hurt Me.
Right.
And I enjoyed it because what he was trying to help people understand is like your brain is very capable of pushing the body past what it thinks it can do. I like that. I got kind of bored about 3/4 of the way through because it was talking about a lot of his ultra marathons, and I was like,
yeah. I agree. I would like to have seen the condensed Reader's Digest version of that book, but I loved the book and I loved him and the concept. Yeah.
But I think that we've got to trust ourselves a little bit more. We've got to understand that most of the answers that we are looking for are within us. Now, it does sometimes take someone else to kind of help unlock some of that, figure it out. But we've got to have that trust within ourselves. Because like you said, you're going from 10 to 20 to, sometimes people go 30 seconds and maybe even longer. I have a friend who he does, what is it called? But he does spearfishing. And he lived in Hawaii for a while. He got to a point where he could hold his breath for 5 minutes.
You think that that's not possible, but clearly he did it.
Right.
So it is possible.
Right. And so when we, kind of coming back to some of the things discussed at Silicon Slopes about this balance between mind and body and some of the things you've mentioned with like your journey, it's amazing. I think stories like that are wonderful because it does inspire people. It helps them look like, that's possible.
That is.
But I have a young lady, I just actually met with her this week. She's working with her on her confidence and her self-esteem and things of that nature. She struggles with depression and anxiety. But one of the assignments I gave her was posture. I told her, I said, the thing is, it's really interesting, is that the mind and body have a very, very symbiotic relationship. What you do to one, you will do to the other. And that can work for or against you. And the easiest thing to do is to target your behaviors because they don't take much effort. It's hard to change our emotions. It's hard to change our cognition sometimes, our thoughts. I said, so I want you just to walk taller. I want you to pull your shoulders back up or pull them back, stand taller, pull your head up, make eye contact and smile. I said, it will communicate to your brain, although you're going to think you're lying, like you're putting on this kind of front, but your brain will start to pick up on this. And it will actually start saying like, oh, we feel good right now. Yeah. We feel bigger. We feel confident. Because everybody that's ever come back after the assignment does feel it. And it's funny that something so simplistic would work like that, but it does. And that's why I say there's so many things like this that we neglect because we think they're too simple. Like, oh, that's not going to work. That's just too easy.
And I think the posture thing, even now I stop and think, what am I walking through life with my neck forward because I feel like I need for people to see me, but can I just stand and sit? And women especially, as we grew up, I grew up as the larger size breast, and there are women who had the smaller size breast, but either one of us felt we needed to put our shoulders forward and hide whatever it was we had. And that has taken me a long time to learn to stand up, just to sit, and this is me. And be okay with that.
Yeah.
So I really think that women, the posture thing, I see it in the gym. I see it when I'm an avid lifter. And so when I see them in the gym, though, and they're hunched over and they're doing a lift, I'm like, oh, they're trying to do... I stopped a woman the other day because she was in her 60s. I'm in my 70s. But she was trying to do a shoulder lift from this position. And she was really struggling. I'm like, girlfriend, watch me. See how hard that is for me to lift that? But if I stand up here and I allow my whole body to push, you see how much easier that is? I said, just try that. She couldn't believe it. The weight that she was struggling with was now so easy for her, just because she stood up and allowed her whole body to support the weight. So when you approach a situation in a one-on-one counseling, do you do group counseling ever or just one-on-one?
I've done some consulting, so the group dynamic. Usually what's coming to my office is usually one-on-one, just individual counseling. Couples will come in as well, but typically it's a one-on-one.
Okay. So when you sit down with someone, and if someone were to come into your office, what are some of the first questions? How do you get to see them, and how do they get to trust you?
Yeah, it's a great question because one of the most valuable aspects of therapy is the therapeutic relationship. When you go in and you meet with somebody, it's got to be a good fit. People have got to feel like they can trust you and that there's someone that is there to take care of them and help them through whatever challenges that they are currently dealing with. So a lot of it is just, I usually like people just to talk about themselves. They can ask me whatever they want. So it's an open book on both ends. And so they can kind of just talk freely, because the thing is, as a therapist, you can gather most information when people just can casually talk about themselves and kind of what's going on within their lives. And so that's one of the big things. And then I'm talking about some of the basics that we always get into, which is where's your foundation? How is your exercise? Are you active? Are you physically active? Are you benefiting from that? How are your eating habits? How are your sleep habits? And are you socializing? Are you getting out? Are you interacting with people? And I always tell people I don't believe there's introverts and extroverts. I think you're somewhere on that spectrum. Some people like a little more alone time than most, but they definitely need people. If you consider yourself an introvert, that's okay, because you probably just need more time alone, quiet time that's not with a lot of people, but you do need people.
Yeah.
And then other people who tend to be extroverts, or they consider themselves extroverts, they like to be social more frequently, but they still need their alone time.
Absolutely.
And so with all those factors in play, when people come in, the biggest thing is making sure that they know that this is their space, this is their time to do whatever they need to do to really focus on themselves. Because life is very busy, and you know this. I mean, you're being pulled in all kinds of different directions. And the therapeutic environment is really that place to slow down for at least an hour and just focus on what's not working. Does that make sense?
It does.
And if people have that, I think that's really valuable to people. And I always tell people, I said, change doesn't happen here. Change will happen when you're not here. This is your place to slow down and focus on the things you need to.
That's an interesting statement. So change, you tell people, change is not happening here. It's outside of here as they what?
They've got to change. The biggest thing is that the brain is really cool. It's an amazing machine.
It truly is.
But that's for and against us sometimes. So if we've gotten into bad habits that the brain picks up on, it will shove it to the subconscious, and I call it autopilot.
Yeah.
And the best example is if you've ever driven a road over and over and over again, there's going to be that moment where you can't remember if you stopped at the stop light or stop sign.
Yeah.
And the thing is, you did. But autopilot has it. And so it's like, you don't have to think about this anymore. We got it. Go focus on other things. But that means we shove a lot of bad stuff in there too, bad habits. So when we try to change that, the brain is really, really resistant. It's like, whoa, we don't do that. We do this. So it's kind of top heavy on the effort. Does that make sense? So the biggest thing is that the change happens outside because you're changing behaviors and you're changing cognitions. And that can't happen within an hour in a week's time frame. You got 168 hours in a week, and an hour's not going to make that happen. But what happens is that you are getting things from that hour that you go out and you start applying. You're kind of your own scientist, so to speak, on your own body and mental and physical well-being. You test it out, you see how it works, and those things that work, you stick with. And as you do that, the change starts happening. And the brain will eventually kind of go like, once you've picked up on better habits that are replacing the old bad ones, the brain picks up on that and goes, okay, this is what we're doing.
Okay.
And that's why
so it is about repetition.
It is.
Retraining.
Yeah.
By simply repetition. Not with a sledgehammer, but just repetition. I think about this a lot, so much, Brandon. I've had enough where I didn't listen to the pinpricks, and then it was a 2x4. And I've had a few freight trains. And I don't ever want another freight train, can I just say? And I really don't want another 2x4.
Yeah.
So can I please just listen to the little things that say, turn this way? The little whisperings that this is a good direction for you. Okay. And by habit, I've learned to listen rather than ignore those whisperings. And I have formed new habits for myself. And that's really what you're talking about. Getting in the habit of good things.
Yeah. And see, that's great. That point is something I think everybody and hopefully all your listeners are kind of absorbing. Because here's the thing. I always tell people, I said in 19 years of doing this, I've never seen the solution to a problem that someone's come in with to be complicated. It's never complicated. And it's always simplistic. And I always say the caveat to that is, doesn't mean it's easy. Because you got to do some hard things to kind of shift those behaviors or thoughts. I said, but it will never be complicated. And I had this guy come into me years ago, and he was in his 60s, and he had these really intrusive thoughts. He'd had them since he was 15. And we worked together for a little while, and he got to a point where he was doing really well. And he said to me, he goes, when I first came in to see you, he goes, I thought you were full of crap. And I laughed. I said, well, how come? And he said, well, because everything you were telling me was too simple. He said, but it was working. And I said, well, kudos, you did it, because you could have not done it. I told him, look, 50 years of dealing with something, you're going to definitely be looking for a complicated solution.
Yeah.
Because you haven't been able to figure it out. I said, but if you look at all the things you're doing, they are simple applications. And I think we got to remember that about life. Life is not complicated the way that we sometimes make it out to be. And the solutions to whether it be our physical or mental health really are simplistic. Now, we may not know those things yet. We may know some. But once we have them, we've got to trust them because they work. And you look about, I always tell people to look about childhood. So we talked about those 4 things: eating, sleeping, exercise, socialization. And I go, just look at your childhood. I don't know why we needed science to tell us that these things actually work for our mental and physical well-being. We did them as a kid. Yeah. And then I also look at coloring books, and I look at Legos. You've heard of mindfulness. Everybody's pretty much heard of mindfulness. I'm like, those are mindfulness activities. You did them as a kid. And now they're more popular amongst adults than they are actually kids these days. Right. So again, it kind of comes back to that idea of like, let's not overcomplicate things, because a lot of times the solutions to the things that we need are really kind of in front of us. We just aren't doing them.
So on this podcast, we talk about mental health a lot. And I talk about this thing, but I use sometimes different words because even though I'm graduated in social work, I didn't work in that field. Well, for the first 5 years I did. And then I started my own company and went off into 100 different directions as an entrepreneur. But so I use words like, if you are constantly listening to the gut where your fears live, and my listeners can relate to this, then you get knocked off center a lot because your fears have been with you from the beginning, close from the beginning. You've learned them by age 2, by 3, by 4, by 5, by 6, by 7, by 8, and by 8, they're yours, unless you consciously make a shift. And then I talk to my listeners oftentimes about this alignment piece between the head and the heart, and this is always a good place to live. But this piece is always yelling at you, get over here where the safety is. This is not going to go well for you. Get over here. And rather than using this beautiful piece of alignment, we rush right over there. And so to be able to slowly make the habit of listening and coming back into alignment. That's why I loved, and I think everybody related to the movie Inside Out too, because they could see anxiety and they just knew exactly what she was doing and they could see it. And Joy was so interesting. She didn't want to ban anxiety. She just wanted her to come in and play and live in alignment with what everybody, and we all need that fear that says this could not be a good idea, but we can't just let it run wild and crazy. We also talked about, just before the podcast started, about Friends in the series and how much we loved that and shared that back and forth. I only watched the reruns because I was not a part of my life at the going. And we talked about, though, that how when Matthew died, that this entire group came back of friends and really supported him. And that now the doctor is being charged for this use of ketamine. We chatted a little bit about that. So I'm going to delve into a little bit right there. Yeah. Because we may think differently on this, but that's okay.
Yeah.
You know it's okay. But one of the things that I have been thrilled about, the movement back to the use of naturalistic things such as psilocybin, not the chemical, but the actual mushroom, ayahuasca, different things like that. But then you have the synthetic ketamine. Mm-hmm. I have known people, my former husband for one, who was in therapy our entire married life for 28 years, and many times I was with him, and we just never got it right.
Yeah.
And so to say to someone, start therapy, you really will benefit from this, I'm like, I don't know if you will or not. And so, but spend $100,000 throughout your life on going to this person, right, and maybe you'll get lucky and you'll get healed. But to be able to say to someone, there's some alternatives now that could really shift your mind and allow you to see things you didn't understand before, so that the healing process is not 20 years or a lifetime or $100,000, but it can be shortened. I've witnessed that. So I'm really just curious, your thoughts on how those two work together, or maybe they don't work together, and is there value, is there not value? And I want you to know, before you begin, I already have a whole lot of cautions I put in place before I tell anyone. Do you know what I mean? Don't just rush off to the person who says, I'm a shaman. I studied with someone for a month or two, and I know what I'm doing. Okay, so that scares the crap out of me. You know what I mean? But I just want to know from someone who's a professional how you see this.
Yeah, I think that, again, it comes back to this idea of balance. I think we've always got to, again, trust ourselves. Therapy, it's very useful, it's very helpful, but the bottom line is that it's not always the answer in and of itself. It can't be. Because so often it's this accumulation of things that need to be worked on. And I always tell people when they come into my office, you don't even have to call this therapy. You can call it whatever you want. Because the bottom line is that you're just running up against a problem that you do not know how to figure out. And so typically we will tap into the resources that we do have around us. That's coaches, parents, friends, colleagues, all that kind of stuff. And a lot of times, actually most of the time, they tend to have the answers. Because they will say, well, why don't you try this? I did this and it really worked. And you go do it and it works.
Yeah.
The therapist is really just there when those don't have the answers. But then we also have to look at a lot of other things as well. I mean, we have to look at our nutrition. You know, the woman that was on the panel, she talked a little bit about that. Yeah. We have to look at our consumption of food. I mean, I do think that a lot of things that we consume today are deficient. And as a result of that, we are going to suffer. Food created
my problem. Food could solve my problem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and so medication is one of those kind of things that I always tell people. I said, I'm not a big proponent of it, but it has a place. And so the reason why I say not a big proponent is because I want you to work as hard as you possibly can on you so that you are making the progress you can and maybe not need it. But if there's a need for it, then we go there. And I had a young lady or a woman I worked with a while back, and she was adamantly against medication. And she was dealing with some serious anxiety. We talked for a little while, and then she had a break, and she ended up getting hospitalized because of her anxiety. Yeah. And they did put her on a medication. And she came to me and she goes, yeah, that was actually really needed. Like, she was able to say, like, no, I definitely needed the medication they were giving me. So it's necessary. And I had another guy, again, anxiety. And this is when I was up in Oregon working at the hospital up there. And he had come into me in almost in a panic. He had this project coming up, and I tried to walk him through the breathing. I said, you can use this, but I said, I'm not sure you have enough time between here and here in order for this to be effective and you to have it down yet. I said, so what I want you to do is, if it does become an emergency, call into the hospital or call into me, and we'll get you a PRN. A PRN is one of those medications you can just take on an as needed basis. I said, because you're probably going to need it.
Okay. You could see that. Yeah.
So the thing is that it is, again, the trusting ourselves is a big thing, because another woman I had, she was on antidepressants for quite some time. She hated them eventually, but she was like, they're the only thing that helped me kind of survive. And so that was what she was using. But eventually she shifted to supplements, like nutritional supplements. She said, I'm getting what I need from this, so I don't need to be doing that anymore. So again, it's coming back to that idea of saying, like, okay, what do I need? And do I need a therapist? Or do I need to shift my eating habits? Do I need to go get blood work? Or do I actually need to get on a...
Actually, I always say yes.
Yeah.
The first answer to that is yes. You have to know where the baseline is.
Yeah. It's good because you can see if there's a deficiency somewhere within you. I mean, it's a woman came into me, she dealt with neurological issues, like pain. And like she goes, my skin always feels like it's on fire. So I said, well, anxiety tends to exacerbate any kind of neurological issues. I said, so let's work on that. And then we talked for a little while, and then she got to a point, I said, where are you on your pain scale? Because she would say it was about an 8. Like, she was always at about an 8 in terms of like the discomfort. And we talked for a little while, and then I asked her, we're checking in. I said, where are you right now? And she goes, I'm at about a 4. I said, good. I said, I think that's where we need to be, because I think the doctors are going to have to handle the rest of it, because this is obviously something that they're trying to figure out. Right. But you're at a manageable level now. Like, you can deal with a 4. 8's like really difficult.
When you start thinking, really, how long can I deal with this, and do I want to deal with it?
Yeah. So it's one of those kind of things where it's good that we have the science that we have. I do think the naturalistic way of going about it is probably better, because I watch the side effects of a lot of these pharmaceuticals, and also getting off of them is really, really difficult. And so if you can go down a more naturalistic way, you want to. There's a lot of different ways to do that. And that's where you're the expert, because you know your body better than anybody.
Yeah. And I do tell people that just step in to what your natural knowing tells you. Mm-hmm. And when you talk about it, when you read about it, when you hear people talk about it, don't be dissuaded by what they say. This is a body thing. I know you've probably read The Body Keeps the Score, and the body knows way more than we give it credit for.
Yeah. I don't want to sidetrack, but I do want to come back to what you were mentioning between the mind and the heart.
Yes.
Because that's really...
I saw you light up when I said that, so tell me about that.
Point. So it's interesting when you mentioned that. I was like, that's solid. It's a really, really good thing that you're kind of putting out there, because there's a book out called Empowered, and I had it's for adolescent anxiety. Maybe this is where he got some of this, but
I've never read it, but I've seen it.
I was asked by a former client if I knew anything about it for their child, and I said, well, I haven't read it. Let me read it, and then I'll let you know. There wasn't anything groundbreaking in it, except for one thing that I took from it. I was like, that's fascinating, but makes sense. They said that there was research out showing that the heart has its own set of memories, that it holds certain memories. So they're separate from the brain, which I was like, that kind of makes sense, because that seems like where heavy emotions, potential trauma can be held. But you talked about like that alignment. And the thing is that I do think our hearts are telling us the truth faster than anything.
And they're always right.
Yeah.
This, you got a 50-50 chance.
Yeah.
But this, aligned with this, is always right.
And that's the challenge. Aligning the two, because I do think that we're not taught really how to trust our instincts, so to speak, our intuition, our heart, however you want to call it, whatever you want to call it. Because I do think it's telling us a lot more than we're paying attention to. What happens though is it is telling us something, and our brain confuses it, because we've gotten so much information that's come in that we're trying to sort through all of that, when this is going like, this is what you need to do. And when they do align, like you said, you're spot on.
Every time.
And that's what you've got to do is like, okay, how do I train myself to be able to get these two to align better? Because when they do align, it's the confidence, you'll feel it. You'll know like, no, this is right. I know it. I know you're saying like, how do you know that? And you're like, I just know. But the heart is a really interesting thing that now we have research supporting the idea and understanding our heart a little bit more, and going like, hey, it's actually holding its own set of memories. And when you think about it, you're like, that would make sense.
It's crazy. I love to read about the brain. I love to read what the brain scientists are doing and putting out there. And when I read for the first time the amount of brain cells that we have in our heart and the amount of heart cells that are in our brain, I'm like, duh, they're supposed to work together. They're communicating. We're the ones that are not listening. Wow, Brandon, you've been just a delight. We're going to include at the end of this podcast, so people can find you, we'll include your website and contact information if people want to reach out to you, if they're feeling like this is a good direction for them. Maybe they just have questions that they can actually, and they know, you can always reach out to me, and I will try and direct you to Brandon, because you are not only a man of the brain, but you are a man of the heart. And you've learned to understand your gut. And so when I saw you, that was the reason I was so drawn to you, and I knew it, is that you walk in alignment.
Well, I appreciate that. I hope. I try. I've got to teach it. And
Wait a minute. There is no try. There is only do. You either are or you aren't. And none of us are doing it 100% of the time. But when you are doing it, you're doing it completely. Yeah. And I love that about you. Brandon, thank you so much for being here and being part of our Crafting a Meaningful Life.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Crafting a Meaningful Life.